On behalf of the organisation, it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's live interview with Ms. Fischer-Møller. Ms. is Professor of Food Policy at SRUC and leader of SRUC's Future Food Systems Research Centre, which aims to discover transformation paths towards more sustainable food systems. So back to tonight's event. Ms. will speak to us for around 30 to 35 minutes, and after that we'll take questions from the audience. You can type your questions into the QA function on screen, and we'll run through the questions at the end of the event. If you can try and keep your questions as concise as possible, we'll attempt to get through as many questions as we can. So with no further ado, let's get started. But first things first, I was privileged enough to live in Copenhagen for 4 years and have tried and failed miserably in my attempt to use the Danish language. On top of that, we've been having an ongoing debate in our office for the last few weeks. So what we really want to know, Miss, is how do we pronounce your name?
Well, that's a key question to me, isn't it? So it's spelled M-A-D-S, but it's pronounced Mads. But you can call me whatever, because I'm getting used to it. I've been here 1.5 years and I've been called many things.
Perfect. Well, I will try my best to get it right for the rest of the evening. So I'm now delighted to hand over to Ms, who will introduce himself, and then we will get started.
Yeah, so good evening everyone. I'm Mads Fischer-Møller. I'm a husband, the father of 3 primary school children, raised in the Danish countryside. So I came home from football practice smelling like pig slurry, and they weren't allowed to go to the living room before I had showered. Denmark is known for being one of the few countries that have 5 times more pigs than human beings. I'm very interested in environmental policy. I'm a foodie, and I was employed by headhunted, recruited to SRUC 1.5 years ago to help establish this new line of work in the Future Food Systems Challenge Center. And I'm also a professor in food policy, so I'm also trying to influence the ongoing food policy debates here in Scotland, of which there are many, and many interesting.
Fantastic. So moving on from that, what I want to ask you first is, so feeding a growing global population in a sustainable way is such a relevant topic for every single one of us that are listening, and every single one of us here tonight. So I thought I'd start by asking you to tell us what motivated or inspired you to get involved with food policy and become an advocate.
To be honest, when I'm a political scientist, so I'm a student of power relations, politics, how decisions are being made, how society is working, and then I've been very interested in environmental policies and environmental issues, and particularly mitigating climate change from a quite young age. So when I started my career, I thought, well, I want to be kind of like working on environmental policy, and there were of course no vacant jobs. And then I found, well, food and food policy, that's kind of like, it's touching, isn't it? And I've worked on farm policy for 3 years, farm subsidies and stuff. And then I've discovered this opportunity, okay, I can actually combine my passion for sustainability, my passion for politics and policy, and my passion for food in this position as a food policy advisor to the Danish government. So I was advising the Danish government for 5 years, and kind of like discovered what food can do when it comes to mitigating climate change, and what role food policy can play in our societies becoming as green and as healthy as we want them to be.
Fantastic. Can you then tell us, please, what do you actually mean by food policy?
Yeah, well, food policy is of course what we expect our policymakers to produce in order for all of us to live healthy, sustainable lives and have good relationship with our food. But as we all know, it is really difficult to make any kind of bold policy statements. I've advised 5 Danish ministers of food and agriculture, and all 5 of them at their first meeting with me as a nutritional advisor, among other stuff. They said, well, I don't want to be the minister who tells people what to eat. So nobody really wants to lead the way when it comes to food policy, because it's not that hard to have environmental policies and changing what goes into the socket, because we don't really care. But we really, really care about our food. We're very passionate about it, and we don't want anyone to tell us what to do. So you have to be more intricate when it comes to food policy. It is oftentimes more about making the right partnerships that helps us create a framework around us so that we are more inclined to make the right choices. We all know that it's way easier to choose pizza over the salad that we know is better for us. And we all jump in there because that's our kind of like our monkey brain tells us that's what we want. We want salt, sugar, fat. So food policy is about trying to rebalance that very skewed table so that it's just so we have a little bit more of a level playing field, and not a field that's stacked against doing the right thing and stacked towards doing all the wrong thing all the time.
Okay. So, moving on, can you describe the previous roles that you had with the Danish government and the Nordic Council of Ministers?
Yes. So, yeah, as I was advising 5 ministers of food in Denmark, food and agriculture. I was their speechwriter and the main advisor on nutritional policy, on all matters of small-scale production, niche productions, and crucially gastronomy and food culture. So that wasn't a big part, and it's not a natural part for a government to go into having an advisor on food culture, because food culture isn't that something that's just there, but it isn't. You can, as a government, with a range of tools, actually start working with the food culture. So you bring about a food culture that's better. So you don't put the pressure on the individual to do the right thing, but you create a culture that makes it easier for the individual to make the right choice. So I was advising the Danish government and the various Danish ministers for a number of years on those issues around what we eat. And for the past 5 years previous to joining SRUC, I was then doing a similar job for all 5 Nordic governments and the 3 territories who also have their own governments, Faroe Islands, Greenland, and Åland Islands. So these 8 countries, they want to cooperate, and whenever they wanted to cooperate on anything food related, they came to me and said, figure out how we do this. So it could be kind of like common communications plans for nutrition, or it could be animal veterinary contingency planning, so that if some disease was spreading from Russia into Finland, the other countries were notified, or it could be reducing food waste or fighting antimicrobial resistance. So a much broader portfolio of work. So I do think that I have as a kind of like a food policy octopus that has had my tentacles in many different places and know a lot of stakeholders around all the Nordic countries who wants to change the food system.
Fantastic. And are you able to pinpoint any major successes in terms of change of policy during your time as a civil servant?
Definitely. So yeah, luckily I'm not necessarily responsible for them, to be honest. It's always much more of a teamwork and has to be usually working in partnership. But we can see that food policy matters. We've seen that Norway, for instance, made a very a big effort to change to reduce food waste. We know that food waste makes up almost 11% of global greenhouse gas emissions, of total global greenhouse gas emissions. If food waste was a country, it would be the 3rd largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. So reducing food waste is kind of like a no-brainer when it comes to interventions. But it's hard to do because we can't go into every single kitchen, take the waste and do the right thing. It's a lot of micro decisions, and it's a lot of things happening through the supply chain. And through a lot of a really concerted effort from the Norwegian government, they've managed to reduce food waste over a 10-year period by 25%, which then perhaps is the main contributor to reducing greenhouse gas emissions from Norway in this time period. And it hasn't cost a lot of money. So many of the most successful interventions in food policy does not necessarily have to cost a lot of money, because it's more about changing the structures that allows us to do the right thing. We can have a similar example from Finland, where the Finnish food system, Finland isn't known as a big food nation, but they do produce a lot of not least dairy cattle, and otherwise Finland is also very well known for oats, but oats is like a low value product. But in Finland now we see huge innovations when it comes to plant-based proteins. We've seen that through innovation partnership with the Finnish government, research institutions, we see a flurry of like new successful businesses from oats, and even making food products from leftover tree fibers, so that Finland is now starting to be kind of like a high-tech food nation, which they never were before, but clever food policies that support and enables other players to do the right thing can certainly completely change the dynamics in a food system, and can embolden entrepreneurs to say, okay, I probably would have gone into tech, but now I want to go into insects, because insects, they are really cool. So food policy can sometimes also support kind of like an entrepreneurial culture, as we've seen it in Finland at the moment.
We touched on this a little bit earlier, but can you explain the connection between food policies set by the government that influence the food systems and the effect that that has on the nation's health?
Yeah, so of course we know that food is a very big determinant for a nation's health. We also unfortunately have Europe's worst diet here in Scotland. We know that 25% of Scots are obese, which is staggering. So we are, and it's just going in the wrong direction. It has been going in the wrong direction rapidly for 20 years. So food is a major contributor to ill health, and that can be reversed. But food policy, we know that if we just go and say people to a citizen, you should eat differently, that won't work. The Food Standard Scotland said that in their strategy that came out this summer or last summer, and they say, well, we have 25 years of failed interventions behind us, so we need to be way more creative. And food policy can play a role in changing the health and the sustainability of a nation, but you need to make clever food policies. You need to understand that you can't make it alone. If I'm yelling to everyone as a minister, say you have to eat differently, the main result will probably be that I won't be elected the next time around. But if I do it cleverly, I can actually accomplish something. But it needs to be, you need to have a vision for where do we want to go as a nation. We can't just accept a status quo that we can see we're dying from the food we're eating at the moment. And farmers in Scotland aren't making enough money. They could make more money if we had a more well-functioning food system with more local produce, more value adding in Scotland. Similar to, for instance, whiskey, we should have a whiskey for many of the other food products, not just for barley. So we need to have a vision of where we want to go. For instance, the Good Food Nation has been kind of like a talking point for Scottish policymakers over the past 7-8 years, but it's still, it doesn't have a lot of content. It's not clear to everyone what is the Good Food Nation Scotland. So I would love to have a stronger vision of what is a good food nation. Then not necessarily a lot of money put into it, but some kind of support for all the great new ideas. Let 1,000 flowers flourish. Policymakers can't say this is the only way towards a better food nation. Well, no, we want to go in this direction, but we want everyone to contribute with what they have. So set money aside that can enable 1,000 flowers to flourish, and then build partnership that can take the best of those ideas and bring them into the mainstream. So you can, with food policies, well-designed food policies, and a clear vision, you can actually achieve change. That's what we've been seeing in, not least, for instance, in a country like Denmark, my native country. 15 years ago, you wouldn't be able to find good food in Denmark. My wife's brother-in-law, anyways, her auntie's husband. He's English, and he's a vegetarian, and vegetarianism has been way bigger here on these shores than it's been in Denmark traditionally. when he came to Copenhagen to visit us 15 years ago, the only thing he could get that was like a vegetarian option was to go to the sausage vendor and then ask for a hot dog without the sausage. It even has a name in Denmark because it's known as the only vegetarian option. It's called a krasser, which means a scratching thing. It's not nice. It definitely doesn't taste
Sounds
nice.
awful.
That was the level of catering to someone who didn't fit with the system of lots of meat all the time. And that has completely changed now. Now Copenhagen has on the recent list of the 50 best restaurants in the world, Copenhagen has number 1 and 2. We weren't used to having these kind of lovely restaurants. How did that come about? Well, it came about because partly the government supported and embraced a narrative of change, that the food sector could really change. We could strive for something else other than just delivering bulk product at a stable, high value, but we could go towards not just delivering a good ham, but doing the Parma ham that brings a revenue that's maybe 6 times higher. We did not want to make just the bulk good Carlsberg that we know, but we also now make a beer that costs 20 times more, and that completely rearranged how brewery was thought about. So government supported that kind of radical idea that things can be vastly different, and at the same time set aside a little bit of money to support all the good ideas, and then had partnerships that allowed, once the good ideas were kind of like trickling up towards some of the bigger players like Arla Foods or Danish Crown, Tulip, the big slaughterhouses, they then embraced these ideas, and with partnership with the government started to then bring it into like the mainstream. So you can change the fate of a nation's food if you want to with food policy.
Moving on from that, we've sort of talked about the other end of the scale, but when we look at low-income families, cheaper foods obviously tend to be higher in fat and sugar, and are often the only option that people can find, or they think they can find. Can food policy help address this?
It should, yeah, but it is of course difficult because some of the more food policy leans into being partnership driven, then it's also driven by commercial interest with the business partners, and then oftentimes what the policy will support is kind of like the organics or more varieties of vegetables, which does not necessarily help the ones that are struggling to get by. So some of these problems, to be fair, should probably be addressed somewhere else outside of food policy because they are part of a traditional, more class-based society that we have in these shores compared to Denmark. Yeah. I've hardly ever had these kind of conversations in Denmark because we don't see the same inequality in food. So you can say, well, we can put on a Band-Aid with food policy, but some of the root causes should be addressed elsewhere. But you can do something with food policy. We can make it easier to redistribute food, but to be fair, we shouldn't need food banks at all. Yeah. We can, and that's something where we should be even do better, and Scotland is doing quite well. We can use the places where everyone's having the same meal, for instance in school, to nurture the kids, to make sure that they are having a proper meal that can support them for the whole day. When my kids, privileged kids from privileged Stockbridge, come home after school, they're hungry because the food they're getting isn't nourishing enough, and we can definitely do more there. So we have a range of places where we can intervene for everyone, and we can do targeted interventions, but quite frankly, we shouldn't need to.
Okay. Having lived in Denmark myself, and obviously being Scottish, I can see the differences and the similarities, but could you maybe explain the differences and the similarities between Scotland and the Nordic countries in terms of culture, consumer behaviour, the climate, the political landscape, the fragility of the food chain?
Yeah, I think, well, we are very similar when it comes to humour, when it comes to what we want to achieve in our lives. It's very easy for a Dane to adjust to living in Scotland, even during a COVID lockdown. It has been so, and it hasn't been surprising at all. We are very similar. Growing tradition-wise, of course, the Nordic region is larger than Scotland, so parts of Denmark has more fertile soils than parts of Scotland. But overall, we are also in the same climatic belt. We have some of the same growing conditions, so we should be able to aspire towards the same things. And we want to do good in the world. We don't want our food system to just be a free ride. I know that NFUS here in Scotland and the Scottish Food and Drink Partnerships, everyone want to really be net zero, want to live up to the commitments, and we see the same kind of passion, and not just saying stuff because they need to, but actually also wanting to do the hard thing, even though it's hard. So I think there's a lot of similarities. I think some of the discussions around what's achievable when it comes to changing the food system have progressed less here in Scotland than it has in most of the Nordic countries. So we're transitioning towards a food system where meat is not necessarily the backbone of everything we do has become less of a red flag in front of farmers in Denmark, because they are leaning into that. They can see, well, it might not be as profitable being a lamb farmer or beef farmer 20 years from now, and it is today, so we might want to look at other alternatives. The Scottish discussions around meat specifically are a little bit more tense, and it's a little bit more defensive. And I'm not saying that people should change the way they're farming because of the environment, but I think we have to have some good conversations about what will the market for meat look like in the future when plant-based alternatives are surging and a third of all Brits say they're flexitarian, vegan or vegetarian. What will the market for these products look like 10, 15 years from now? We aren't as progressed in Scotland on some of these very tough discussions as I'm seeing it in Denmark, where we now have kind of like public guidance that tells you have to increase tenfold your consumption of pulses, because that's part of solving climate change. More pulses, less meat. That's the message from the Danish government. It weren't possible to say 15 years ago or 10 years ago when I was advising them, but that's starting to be a common view of the world. So I think one key difference is where are we at in the kind of like the food systems discussion, and another key difference is that farming is organized very differently. Here, farmers are more kind of like more individual farms fighting on their own, which makes it much harder. Whereas most of the Nordic countries, the farmers work together in these big cooperatives, which gives them more agency over the market. So the farmers aren't necessarily just in the hands of Waitrose or whoever they have kind of like an agreement with. No, they can set their own prices, so farmers are better protected and have better options to kind of like face the difficult challenges together. So I have to figure out, okay, how do I work with farmers who are structured very differently here compared to Denmark?
Yeah.
That's a key difference as well.
And in terms of consumer behaviour, how do you think, we're obviously quite traditional here, we've got deep-seated habits, probably maybe the same in Denmark, 10 years ago, but these habits are embedded in our culture. How do you move people on to make these changes? Yeah,
well, first of all, it's not necessarily radical changes we need. It's oftentimes, I've been working on dietary advice the most of my career, and what we're talking about can be slight changes. It's maybe just change one plate of sausages a week to one plate of salmon, and maybe skip one out of your five dinners with meat for one without. And so it's not necessarily radical changes. Much of that can be achieved by most people. And some want to go way further and be vegan or vegetarian. That's fine. It's not necessarily the gospel I'm preaching, but if that's how they want to contribute to solving, to maintaining their own health and solving global challenges, that's very fine by me as well. So what can be done to change a food culture? Well, as I talked about earlier, some top-level visions about that shows that change is actually achievable and that it can be tasty and fun and delicious. People aren't going to Noma, which is currently kind of like one of the best restaurants in the world, because it's sustainable and green. No, they go there because they expect something extraordinary And then also they figure out, oh, and they actually don't serve any animal protein this part of year because they don't find it necessary in the summer because the plants taste so lovely. But they don't want to serve only plants in winter because it's just too dull, so they have a lot of fish there. So having some pioneers that shows that expands the vocabulary and the range of thinking and ideas that's acceptable is really, really keen on changing a food culture. And you can actually then have food institutions that help this along. Whereas kind of like the think tank for public sector food, we could have, with the new policies that support and give free school meal for the vast majority of Scottish primary school children, well, we could have a great vision for what kind of food they were to be served. And we could have a think tank that developed the new Scottish food culture based on local produce that was supposed to be served for all kids from P1 all the way up to P5 and hopefully even further. Then all of these kids will be experiencing a new food culture every day. So you can definitely do it in both a democratic way and led by food policy. But we can't go in and say, well, you just need to change your ways because I say so. And we probably have to accept that it will be harder for some. So I think starting early and creating kind of like a think tank and a vision for a change we want to see, that's really key.
So education is key then?
Yeah, I think food education, not necessarily, again, education as in you have to do this, but rather education through lived experience. We've seen for instance, in Copenhagen, we've seen that kids who get good meals in school, they bring that knowledge back home to their parents. They persuade their parents to eat differently. And when kids come to their parents and say, Mom and Dad, could we try to make dal? The parents are thrilled, and maybe that's the first time the parents are ever cooking dal, at least in Denmark, where it's not that common. I know it's way more common in these shores due to your background and heritage with India and Pakistan. But so the kids have a role to play, not necessarily learning and being taught food, but living food. And we have a role to play in securing that the food they get is something that's worth bringing on to their parents and to their friends. And yeah.
So it's far more subtle then?
Yeah, it's just about getting the right food in everywhere. Getting as good quality food in everywhere. Policy can have a role to play to, again, stack the deck a little bit towards the right things, because we know that the playing field is tilted against doing the right thing and towards doing all the wrong thing, with deep-fried Mars bar as the worst example. Not that I find that super appealing, but it exists, yeah. So make sure that anywhere we have the chance as a community, as a society, to say, well, we want to serve this nurturing meal, let's do that. And lead by example. Make sure that an organization like Scotland Royal College serves up the kind of food that we want our students to produce for the future.
Do you think that people will view these changes favourably in terms of policy, or could it be seen by the public as their personal choice?
Yeah, I'm sorry about the pun, but it probably depends on how you serve it. So if you do serve it, if you do present it, not as something that a policymaker tells people to do, but if we have a partnership where Tesco and Sainsbury's and Lidl goes with the Scottish government and say, well, we want to have more Scottish produce and we want to showcase more Scottish plant-based products, because to be honest, it's hard to find in the shops. I want to buy the seasonal produce, and I can buy all the Scottish meats I want, but it's been hard to find a bramble apple that's produced in these shores, but I can find them from everywhere else. Yeah. Well, we could make that kind of partnership. We could work with the supermarkets to make the right kind of foods appealing and exciting, so people won't even know they're being nudged slightly in the right direction. So I think it's about having a common understanding of a trajectory we want to go down, that probably have to have a little bit less meat, quite a lot more fish, quite a lot more fruit, vegetable, and whole grain, preferably locally produced, to make sure that Scottish farmers will be even better off than now. So having that kind of broad vision and creating the kind of partnerships that then makes it easy for everyone to do the right thing. So we kind of like going through the supermarkets have kind of like an exoskeleton on that helps us make the right thing, because we know that our spine's very weak when it comes to food choices, but a lot of players can help us in the right way if we manage to align all the players and make sure that everyone's supporting a common vision. But if there aren't any common vision and everyone's fighting on their own, we'll go towards lowest common denominator. Yeah. And if we are there and someone then comes and say, well, you should be here, then everyone would be like, no, I don't want to listen. Yeah. But the small changes, suddenly people will be a completely different place without ever knowing.
That's a really good place to move on to the next question. So the Challenge Centre that you're working with brings together expertise from across the organisation. So our research groups, our business and commercial arms, our engagement with local and national governments, and the unique relationships with our population. So to understand and transform the world around us. So thinking specifically about the Future Food Systems Challenge Centre that you're leading, how will you harness this SRUC-wide expertise and knowledge?
Yeah, it's a very big question and a very big challenge. So hopefully what I can do, and I think what's been the strongest tool in my toolbox so far, is to show that change is possible. So one, make the horizon scanning that tells the commercial actors, our colleagues here at SRUC, to say, well, we need to understand what kind of change is coming to us, whether we want it or not. And instead of then shying away from the change, let's face the music and dance, and then get together the right kind of groups that starts having some research projects, start having knowledge exchange activities, to share some examples of what, with this transformational change coming, how can we prepare ourselves and how can we make sure that we are relevant in the future food system that might not look radically different, but might look a little bit different, and we need to be prepared for that. So how am I doing that? Well, as much knowledge exchange, as much talking, as much interacting with people as possible, as much helping big businesses, National Farmers Union or Scotland Food and Drink Partnerships, with their horizon scanning, what's coming, where are we now, how does Scotland match with the future we see coming, and then also helping with tangible policy options. Not saying that we need to copy, but sometimes imitation is really good. Oftentimes copying is good, but reimagining things based on someone else's idea is probably even better. So having these kind of workshops where we take the best of things that are working elsewhere, bring that to Scottish policymakers, have a talk with them about how can they, in a Scottish context, take those experiences, use them where they're at, and help them to kind of like kickstart something that and just get them started on a higher level than they would have been if it hadn't been for the Challenge Centre, the knowledge that SRUC can bring to the conversation.
Fantastic. You're obviously clearly experienced at government level, but there are many stakeholders, organisations and groups all the way through the food value chain that will have an opinion, a role to play, and will also need support. So what kind of collaborations and forums would you like to see established to build a two-way policy change rather than just from the top down?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And food is probably kind of special in that way that very often food policy is not necessarily led strongly by the government. Food policy is oftentimes something that's been demanded by industry. We would like you to support us to enable us to go in this direction. So oftentimes food policy is done in these kind of partnerships. And I know that's also very much the Scottish approach. We want to listen to people, we want to do things together. That's good, but it's not only about policy. We need to have these conversations so that a lot of actors understand that their role in the food system might look different 10, 15 years from now. How can I work with Scotland Food and Drink Partnership to prepare them for what's coming? It doesn't have to involve policy at all. It can be a research institution or our commercial division combined with industry. It can also be with the small businesses. I'm looking at looking into kind of like the undercurrent of the Scottish food system, what's happening in organics, what's happening in local foods, what's happening in foraging, what's happening in Scottish pulses production, because I do think that some of these things that seem really niche today, well, they are some of the things that are now part of the food system, food conversation in Denmark. So if we can nurture some of these more niche phenomena, they can then help inspire change in some of the bigger organizations down the line. But if we don't nurture the niche ideas, they will never grow strong enough to challenge and be of relevance to Tesco or Lidl or Scotland Food and Drink Partnership. So it's about both working within the big organizations, sparring with policymakers, and working with the little ones and highlighting all the great things that are actually happening now and help them to speed up their contribution towards a more sustainable food system. But I'm, to be honest, more than happy to speak with anyone who finds me just the slightly interesting, happy to do research project or figure out who in the organization can help them move on with whatever challenge they are having.
Fantastic. I think that's a really good place to end and to start the Q&A. So we're going to start with the first question, Miss, from David Mackay. And David's asking, there's a growing body of evidence linking diets high in ultra-processed foods with chronic disease. How should governments tackle this? Should we adapt a percentage reduction target for UPFs in national dietary guidance, as France has done? Will that address the problem?
It's a good question, and yeah, so ultra-processed foods is oftentimes one way of looking at the problems we're having. And if you're just looking at the most recent national food strategy for England, I know that's for England, but I know that for Food Standard Scotland is also looking to that. They are saying we need to break the junk food cycle, which is a way of saying the same thing. We need to change that. On the other hand, as I say, it's really hard for government to go in and say, don't buy junk food. So what do we do? Well, the first thing we can do is get rid of junk food in school meals, for instance. Get rid of junk food everywhere where we have a complete agency. So we can do it ourselves, but we can definitely, from a government perspective, not have a jelly in all Friday servings at, for instance, my kids' school. There's no need to promote junk food on the government bill. So we can do that. There's a lot to be done with reformulation and reformulation partnership. It's not the most sexy word, but if government and industry goes together and say, this is a part of a problem, you can have these kind of very fine reformulation partnerships where you have a government strategy to, in 10 years' time, slowly reduce the amount of bad stuff in our food. So we've seen that work very well with salt and sugar and fat, and gradually kind of improving health by stealth, it's called. So you don't even notice that you'll get healthier, but the food will still be ultra processed. So can we go back to a food system that's more traditional? Well, what we can do is make sure that all kids learn how to cook, so at least they can opt for that if they want to. But I don't believe that we can expect everyone to spend as much time in the kitchen as I'm doing. We know that the average UK population, only 14% of their meals are home cooked from scratch. So even though we might here at SRUC have a higher proportion of people actually using raw ingredients to cook their meals, well, 86% of us aren't. They are cooking from some kind of processed product and making that into a meal and spending less than 10 minutes. We have to be realistic. This is what most people in the UK are eating. This is the way they're eating. So we can't just say they all have to cook their dal from scratch. No, we have to say, okay, how can we make the processed foods, get rid of the worst part of the processed food, for instance, the abundance of salt, sugar, and fat, and exchange that for something else? And how can we then give kids the choice and the skills so that they learn how to cook in school? Those are my That's probably the best I can do.
I think, and I think I've got the experience of that from living in Denmark, where the processed foods just weren't available in the supermarkets, and where our family did cook, a lot more than.
Even though they actually have less time to cook, so
yes.
to speak, because there are more
Yes.
working moms, but it is a bigger part of continental culture and maybe even Danish food culture to make a home-cooked meal. We can't expect that culture to change overnight, but we can perhaps slightly nudge toward it, and then we can also, with a partnership, sneak out the worst parts of the bad food.
Fantastic. Now the next question is from William Thorpe, and his question is, given your experience of working for a group of countries, are you engaged in drawing together the development of food policy for Scotland, England, Wales, Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland? And if so, what is the top priority?
It's a very good question. I'm not in my current position involved in kind of like drawing things together, and to be honest, I probably won't say we should cooperate, because I don't know where are kind of like the toes that hurt in the cooperation between the countries. You need to understand and have lived here. But I can see that there are some similarities in the way we think about food policy in all of Great Britain and the nations. We see the national food strategy for England. Well, the English market and the Scottish market are very closely linked. So what is true for England is usually true for Scotland as well, which also means that that kind of white paper is also being used here as a core analysis for what is needed to be done. I think in England, when it comes to farm policies, they are also, because farming is a smaller amount of GDP, and it's not as much core necessarily to the soul of the nation in England as it is here. So there are some differences in farm policy, but in food policy specifically, we are pretty similar to what we need to do. There are some differences in the discussion around meat, where Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland are less inclined to kind of like go into a discussion of we need to reduce meat consumption, but more focused on, okay, we have to improve our meat production and make it greener so that we can continue to have this kind of production. So there is a difference in how we talk about farming, but overall the challenges for all the countries in the United Kingdom are kind of similar, but more collaboration could happen, and I'm trying, to be honest, to have these kind of conversations, because there's no need for us in Scotland and in Northern Ireland and in England to develop parallel policies if we can learn from each other. So later this year I'll be co-hosting an event that is focusing on bringing kind of like the food policy discussions in Northern Ireland, Wales, Scotland and England together and say, okay, what can we learn from each other? Where are we at? What can we develop together instead of developing it apart? Because there's no need for not copying when we have good ideas to learn from each other.
The next question is from Lou Ralph, and Lou's asking, for a country like Scotland that has food and drink as a major industry and tourist attraction, why is it that we seem so far behind other countries that might not have had such a high starting point, and can we change things? Yeah,
it's a good question, and to be honest, I've also been a little bit surprised when I'm trying to roam the country as much as I can with restrictions in mind. I haven't been traveling as much as I would have liked in the 1.5 years I've been here, but I can see that I don't find that we are good enough in Scotland to make money from the link between tourism and food. We see that there is, well, the distilleries are great at making money from the tourism. I know that fishing and wild caught salmon have been like a big part of it, but we can see that in a country like Norway, who doesn't have a great food tradition, well, they are really they're selling like local specialities to tourists and charging an extraordinary amount of money. Whereas I would love to pay when I go to Calendar, and I know there are chanterelles in the area, but I don't know where to find them. I would love for someone to have picked up those chanterelles and make it easy for me to access them, and I would definitely pay a lot of money for them. But instead, I go out and then I try to find them myself. And if I find them, I'm the luckiest man alive. And if I don't, I get a little bit disappointed. But we could do more in this area. It's probably about imagination. It's about what we think of food. I know these initiatives are there, but they're not necessarily as abundant as I could see they could be when we are thinking about the amount of tourists that come here. So I think it might look like a niche area, but it's really, really important because it can kind of like stimulate this undercurrent of smaller rural businesses that might not be contributing magnificently to the gross national product of Scotland, but might create for a livelihood of 1 or 2 or 3 more shops in a local area that suddenly feels vibrant and living instead of feeling abandoned. So I think it can play a really big role, and we can probably learn a lot from other countries, not necessarily Italy or France, because they've had those since like the Roman times. We know it's really hard to catch up with that kind of food culture. But what happened in Norway? How come they suddenly accelerated this part of their tourism? And how can we do something quite similar here in Scotland? We do have the potential.
And again from Lou, there's a big interest now in plant-based diets, but are there a lot of plant-based convenience foods that are ultra-processed? Do you think that the message needs to be clearer, that eating meat-free would be better if it was from first principles rather than ready meals?
Yeah, you're probably right, but again, similar to my answer to, I think it was David McKay earlier on, it's hard to do government messaging that says, don't take the easy choice. So I might opt for cooking my own dal, and I might opt for not using a vegan cheese or some kind of higher processed product. But others find that's the only way they can contribute to doing something they feel is a bit better for the environment. Then let them. But I think what's key here is also to understand what kind of problem are we solving. Of course, some of these products might be then better for climate. Oftentimes they are. They require less land to produce, but then they are worse for health. So it's hard for normal consumers to have all of these different dimensions in mind when they're shopping. And we know the average consumer spends 1.4 seconds choosing something in the shop. So it's not as though they have time to read the back of the pack and understand what this is about. So again, I think having partnerships with producers and with retailers and go for a kind of like a health by stealth approach where we take away the worst parts, and again, where we do have more agency, for instance, in school meal, serve the better products, the more authentic products, so that the kids at least know what a proper bean or a black bean or a chickpea tastes like before they only eat it as something that's highly processed. That's key. Highly processed plant protein products, they are better for climate. They might be worse they're usually better for climate than the alternatives. They might be worse for health. And we have to figure out, can we do something that solves both of these problems? We should be able to, but it does require some government intervention in a way that we're not accustomed to here in Scotland. But again, models are there in other parts of the world that we can copy and learn from.
Okay. And the final question for tonight is from John Whitby. And John's saying, as a beef farmer, I champion the countryside. We seem to be losing a lot of land to developments such as housing and transport infrastructure. As we move forwards a more plant-based diet, who will towards a more plant-based diet, who will champion the remaining countryside? The pandemic has shown we need a green lung. How should I change my aspirations and perceptions?
Yeah, what I hope that we can aspire towards, and thank you for that question, because it is quite keen when it comes to food policy discussions here in Scotland, that we understand that we are a meat-producing country. I think it is around 80% of our countryside that goes to production of meat or feed to meat. So it is the vast majority of Scotland that is now meat production. And it probably will be the vast majority of Scottish land going forward. Maybe some of the prime agricultural areas won't have to, but it might be more profitable in the long run to start producing a little bit more cereals or horticulture, because we know that revenue per hectare seems to, the tradition is that it seems to be a higher revenue per hectare for some of these products from highly yielding soils. We'll still have lower yielding soils where grazing is by far the best option, and we'll stick to that. And then to the question, how will we ensure that there are jobs in the countryside? What we also know is that if you change from, for instance, some low intensive, like very extensive, for instance, land grazing that doesn't give a lot of jobs, well, if some of that land can be used for horticulture production, usually it gives more jobs. As I talked about earlier, if we lean a little bit more into alternative business models, where you go towards catering for a tourism industry, that might give more jobs. If we lean into figuring out, okay, how can we keep producing beef, but catering to for instance, the European market are crazy about organics. Can we produce more organic beef here in Scotland and export it to Denmark? Because in Denmark, Scottish beef doesn't necessarily have the same kind of premium ring to it than it does for us here in Scotland. But if it's Scottish and organic, then that might catch you a premium in a different market. So figuring out how can we diversify our production, find niche markets so that we can maybe produce the same quantities or slightly less, but for way higher profits. That might be the way to bring back more lives. And then, to be fair, we also, colleagues of mine here at Scotland Road College, have also looked into, well, can we also create jobs from rewilding efforts? And I know that rewilding, and there's a fight, how should we use our lands? But some parts of that agenda can also give new jobs. It will take away some, but some others will come. So I think we have to be just a bit more diversified in how we think of the land use, but definitely we should also, to the question, try to not increase cities where there are prime agricultural land. That goes all over the world. Cities are where agriculture was great 1,000 or 500 years ago, because that's where you wanted to create the city. Now that's a problem because the good agricultural lands are taken up by cities. It can't be dealt with in food policy. But it's a very valid question that I don't have an answer to, but I think we should pose it to some policymakers who might produce a plan to make sure that our settlements won't interfere with food production. And
that's a fantastic place to stop. What an amazing discussion we've had tonight. And as I said at the beginning of the interview, it's such relevance to all of us, and you've just proved that tonight. So whether it's the policymakers, the producers, the distributors, or the consumers, how can we move this forwards? Because this is something that's affecting our health, our society, our environment, and our economy. So that's a great place to stop. So firstly, I can't thank Mess enough for such a fascinating and informative interview. And I'd like to thank you, our audience, for tuning in with us tonight, asking such relevant and fantastic questions and adding to our discussion. And just to let you know that our next event is going to be held in a month's time on the 23rd of March, when our guest will be Dr. Hannah Rudman, who's the Senior Challenge Research Fellow and Data Policy Lead, who's going to talk to us about digital devices to measure the thriving natural capital. So we'll look forward to seeing you then. Good night.